So, we watched the movie Tristan and Isolde. It's not a particularly recent movie, but it's still a great movie to talk about the intersection between the medieval and the modern, and the way that's something that fascinates our culture, and the way in which there are still values of the medieval world that we long for.
There are three ways to approach this, though, that I was thinking about, right? We have a modern movie, right?
Yes, right.
How did it fare as a modern movie? Did it tell a successful and satisfying story in the end? That's the one question. And then, how well did it interpret a medieval myth to modern audiences?
Right.
What element of the medieval myth was captured? Did it leave anything out? What does this say about us in terms of why, as you mentioned, why do we like medievality? Why are we still making movies like this now? Why is there a whole genre of Middle Ages movies? Why is that?
Well, I think that the first thing to do is to very, very quickly recap the basic bones of the Tristan and Isolde story to kind of focus everybody. And the idea is that the Tristan and Isolde story is very, very similar to the story of Guinevere and Lancelot, where she is the wife of a king, and he is that king's greatest knight, and as is a classic chivalric tale, they fall hopelessly in love, and their love eventually puts the whole kingdom in jeopardy.
We have King Mark and his British baronies, right?
Yes.
The movie specifically sets itself just after the Romans leave Britain. So after the fall or the evacuation of Rome in 400 AD, right? So in the next 100 years,
ago.
all of the Pax Romana, all the Roman rule and all of the law and order that the Romans imposed is gone. And we're left with, for lack of a better word, British lords or barons who rule over isolated kingdoms. And the isolated kingdoms war with one another. And they're also oppressed by the Irish. The kings there are more consolidated, more powerful, and they come and they easily dominate the squabbling British lords.
A very, very interesting sort of take on the story. That Ireland here is the big bad aggressor. Not a story you often hear told about medieval Ireland, but okay.
Well,
we'll just roll with it.
Right, so for most of its history, Ireland is oppressed by the British.
That's right.
800 years of oppression. So why have we reversed the roles? And this brings up another question. So this is essentially an Irish myth.
Well, and Cornish.
Welsh bards. Irish mythology.
Yes.
Preserved by the French and translated, as we talked about before, into the German and the Italian.
Yes, right.
So what's happening? And there's another small, brief discussion here. When we think about the mythology of Britain, we always think about Arthur.
Yes.
And then we think about Merlin some of the time, too.
Yes.
But it's very distinct. And the Knights of the Round Table, and then we think of Lancelot and Guinevere, and then we think of Gawain and Sir Bors and Sir Kay and Percival and all those people.
Sword of the Stone.
Right.
The Cloven Oak, that sort of thing.
And then we may even begin to think about Robin Hood.
Yes, right.
Right?
Yes.
Another classic mythological tale. Now, when we think about Irish mythology, suddenly our mind doesn't come up with anything so handy.
Yes.
Or so clear. We have Welsh mythology, mostly from Lloyd Alexander.
Yes, right.
The Black Cauldron.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And the reason we know about it is because of Lloyd Alexander.
The spiral castle, the castle with the great labyrinth, and the dead kings interred at the bottom of the castle that will rise if you come to despoil the castle or under a certain enchantment. So yeah, bits and pieces of the Welsh.
Right. Why is there no Irish mythology that's so distinctly clear?
That's a vast and complicated question.
Yes, it is.
But it ties directly in with 800 years of oppression.
Yes.
And who was telling the stories. Because, again, you could say the same about Scotland. Most of the stories coming out of Ireland and coming out of Scotland are stories of the resistance to the British oppression. Right. So the Bruce and Blind Harry's Wallace.
William Wallace. That's
Yes.
right, yeah.
So the legendary heroes that you have are from the period of British oppression. Not that there isn't a folklore that reaches much farther back and that you can still access those stories in libraries and things like that, but they're not present in our imagination because our cultural imagination is dominated by English stories. Because for a long time the English were the storytellers.
They never really solidified their stories into a single narrative. They remain diverse, they remain varied and multi-layered and perhaps more rich, but perhaps less resilient and less persistent. So when we talk about Tristan and Isolde, there was a storyline that was captured there and preserved whole. And in fact, there is good authority that it was captured and brought to France, and it was the French. Of course, we know that Chrétien de Troyes was the one who created the whole Lancelot mythology.
Yes, right.
Didn't exist. That whole love triangle didn't exist until it got to France and then was imported, reabsorbed back into England. Probably from Tristan and Isolde, as you mentioned at the start. That's probably where it came from.
Yes.
Because they were so enamored of it. The French, love, There was lack of love in the Arthur myths before that.
Yes, that wasn't what it was about until the courtly love fad swept Europe, and the idea of the queen secretly longing not for the king that she married, but for his greatest knight. Somehow the idea, very, very clear, that the king can't also be the greatest knight. You see that tension in the Arthur myth, where Arthur is the greatest knight in the medieval versions of Arthur, and then this Lancelot guy comes up, and we feel like Lancelot, as the greatest knight, ever, deserves the most beautiful, the most wonderful, the most desirable woman as his paramour, and we're looking around for that woman, and she's married.
That's the Arthurian myth,
Yeah.
and there's a lot to say about that. For example, I really think that those are two distinct mythologies that somehow have become conflated in our mind. The idea, like you said, of Arthur as the greatest knight and his advisor and semi-magical wizard, Merlin.
Yes, right.
That's a story.
Yes.
That doesn't really have Guinevere in it at all. And didn't when Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote the whole thing down. There was no triangle there at all.
That's
and
right.
it was a completely satisfying mythology on its own.
Yes.
And then we have this other mythology of the king. Almost, you get the idea he's sort of aged a little bit. Arthur.
Mm-hmm.
This is when he's older and he's got his knights and he sits back in the castle while they go out and have adventures.
That's
so
right.
Arthur's
Yeah.
adventuring days are done. And then he has this beautiful queen, and she's a little bit more adventurous herself. We sort of have that here in Tristan and Isolde.
Interestingly enough, Tristan and Isolde gives Isolde a lot more space and a lot more justification than Guinevere ever has. Because in most cases in the original roots of the myth, she is not just a girl who happens to fall in love with a boy and follow her heart. The reason that she pursues relentlessly this improper and unfortunate, i.e., outside of marriage, love, is because of a love potion. So there's a place there where she's not at fault.
Right, yes.
And she's also a captive, as we mentioned before. She doesn't choose to marry Mark. She doesn't have a choice. She's being bartered by kings. And that's a very interesting space for her to occupy.
It absolves her of the blame that we often ascribe to Guinevere. Why does Guinevere do what she does? And there's a tension between the courtly love and the amorous love.
Right.
The idea is, initially there was the idea that Lancelot was going to love her from afar, Petrarchan love,
Yeah.
that he was pledging his love and his passion to her, but they would never meet, they would never touch. Because that's what you did in courtly love. All of my heart is pledged to what's-her-name, and I have a favor from her, but my life is on the battlefield and her life is in court, and we may never meet.
Because all I need is
This is
that
all I need,
inspiration.
and pure.
Yes.
Right? Now, this did not happen, and why not? We have the love potion. Right?
That's right. So we have the love potion as an inexorable magical force, pushing the two of them together. And also because that's not the story that we're telling. We're not telling a story of a frozen nobility who is able to exist inside these marble stereotypes. We're telling a story with a little bit more blood in it, both literally and figuratively.
Okay. I like the fact that we're making these characters more real, whereas they're more abstract in, say, the Guinevere style. But when we get to Tristan and Isolde, and I use the Italian pronunciation because that's where I learned it. Right?
Yes.
Like you said, we have the love potion to sort of absolve them of a little bit of blame, right? And yet in this movie, we don't have the love potion.
Even though she's still an apothecary. Even though the movie insists that she's an apothecary and she's a healer, and you see a moment where maybe they toyed with that idea in the movie.
Well, because we had the poison, we have to do that. That's
right.
one of the major drivers of this. Okay, so this is the problem, one of the questions that I have about the movie as opposed to the myth.
Yes.
The movie shies away from actually having a love potion created. Now, one of the reasons they did that is because the person who created the love potion in the mythology is the mother.
Yes.
And there is no mother figure here.
That's right. We start with her funeral as a way to absolve her of blame that she let this happen to her daughter. Mm-hmm. Traditionally in literature, when you want a girl to be headstrong and willing to risk everything, you've got to take away that mother figure so that she grew up not knowing how her mother, the great queen, negotiated this world so that nobody could teach her when to fight and how to fight and when to yield and how to build a life inside the pressures of the world and the way that the world values queens and princesses and uses queens and princesses.
Interestingly enough, Tristan doesn't have any parents either.
Yes, right.
So that is a classic mythological trope, a fairy tale trope. When you have a protagonist who has no parents.
That's right.
The sky's the limit. That should be incredibly limiting, and in fact it is. All the oppressive forces act on him or her, and there's almost nothing she can do. Cinderella is left in the cinders, right?
Yes.
But at the same time, if she has no parents, she has no class that she's constrained to, she has no limits placed on her. Suddenly this is also simultaneously a liberating thing.
That's right.
So that Tristan becomes the greatest general because he doesn't have to live in the shadow of his father or the complex baronial arrangements that everybody has. He can just go fight with the freedom that maybe, and you notice that Mark's son doesn't quite have.
That's right. I thought it was a very interesting thing that the movie made the point that Mark's son is actually a strategist and a politician and would make a good king. It's just that his father can't see it. Tristan doesn't have the pressure of a father who doesn't value him. Right. Tristan doesn't have the pressure of a father at all, only a father figure.
He has a father figure, but he doesn't have to follow in the footsteps of Mark. He can be his own riotous, unconcerned, irresponsible person. Yes. Whereas Mark's son is following his father's example, and his father is not the one out leading the charge, right? His father is the one sitting behind, strategizing, conspiring with and against the barons, and that's what his son is learning.
Yes.
Is learning how to do that. Tristan doesn't need to worry about that. He just lets Mark take care of that, and he just fights.
That's right, and doesn't need to think that way. The movie was very, very fair to Mello.